Alright guys, so as the fireworks went up into the sky, I couldn't help but just think to myself how crazy 2024 was. We saw asset confiscations, undeniable trade wars, and the Federal Reserve screwing up once again. And 2025 just got crazier. I was just wondering to myself, could it get any worse? And it's supposed to be a happy new year, and yes, I want to wish everyone here an awesome journey ahead. But I can't say the same for Europe. In fact, for the EU, it's a fragile economy. It's probably not going to be a very happy new year. And this marks the first big escalation of the conflict in 2025, which has spilled over once again into the economic front. And interestingly enough, it's a self inflicted blow by the West on their own industries. Now, 5 decades of Russian gas flowing to Europe has ended. The 50-year deal was ripped apart by Ukraine, and Russia has now confirmed it. Gazprom, Russia's national energy company, has halted gas flows through Ukraine into Europe. So Eastern Europe is directly impacted now. Slovakia and Hungary will have an energy crisis, which kind of actually tears apart their relations in the EU, especially with Brussels. Now, the EU experiment has always been fraught with a lot of challenges. Their economies are just too different. The currency, the euro, is also incompatible with every member country. It actually benefits Germany more thanks to its rigid monetary policy here. However, when you throw in a new energy crisis that hits Eastern Europe hard, it adds more pressure on these countries. Even if the bloc doesn't break away, we could see individual diplomatic shifts eastwards. So Russian gas exports through the Sutza pipeline have ended. Ukraine has control over the pipeline, so Orban and Fico, they're out of luck. Their economies rely heavily on Russian pipeline gas. More than 75% comes from Moscow. And as we mentioned before, Europe will also get hurt. Flows through Ukraine accounts for 5% of total EU gas imports, and this is cheap pipeline supply, almost 40 to 50% cheaper than any other gas flows into Europe. Any other alternative, especially LNG, will only cost more. The EU is about to face higher energy prices, which is horrible when winter just started. But I want to focus a bit more on the diplomatic disaster for the Eastern European countries. Ukraine just ramped up the pain, and it's hard to understand why. Kiev earns up to $1 billion annually, vital revenue. They kind of need to bankroll their own war efforts. Slovakia, on the other hand, isn't happy about this. Thanks to this shut off, their economy just got walloped significantly. Fico says his country earns almost half a billion euros in transit fees alone, and that's moving their Russian supply to the rest of Europe. A lot of money for quite a small economy. In addition, their gas company now has to pay nearly $100 million more to get imports elsewhere. And no matter where the gas comes from, it's going to be more expensive than the Russian supply. That is a fact. Now, would it be a surprise if more EU countries broke away from the agenda of Brussels? We could see more member states move closer and closer towards BRICS. And it's going to happen because individual economies are being hit. It's becoming an existential crisis for the whole bloc. Now, the first problem, of course, is refilling the gas storages. Gas storage in the bloc will have to be refilled back to at least 90% of capacity by November this year. It's going to leave Europe scrambling to refill more volumes at a higher price. The colder winter gets the greater demand for gas gets as well. And without Russian supply, the world's going to take full advantage of this. In mid-December, storage levels were already at 75%. Compare that to the previous year, which was 90%. So this drainage is coming in fast and furious. It's not a stretch to imagine levels to go below 50% by the end of March, maybe even below 40%. Especially with this cutoff, there's really a big rush to bring in alternatives. Now, Volkswagen is on the verge of shutting down plants in Germany. The French company Stellantis, they are also in panic mode. There's simply no way to divorce the relationship between industry and affordable energy. Now, even in the EU's Commission's own report, there is no way to hide the de-industrialization happening. It's a very recent report in December, just 2 weeks ago, and it confirms everything we have known for a very long time. Sure, natural gas prices have indeed come down from the peak in 2022, but it's still higher than before. As a result, producer prices for energy are still very much elevated. That's how much industries pay for their power. Germany and the rest of Europe are paying 25 to 50% more than the United States. It's a big reason why German companies have left Europe to set up shop in the US. The market there is bigger and producing cars there is cheaper. Now, with this Russian cutoff, it's not going to make things easier. The EU isn't going to suddenly rise from the ashes and outcompete the US, China, or even Japan. Manufacturing is done. We have heard a lot about how Europe is decoupling with China. Now, a big part, of course, is the EU being part of the G7. Now, the tariff on Chinese EVs didn't help for sure, and don't expect China to help the EU out of goodwill. That ship has sailed all the way into the sunset. And because of Europe's energy crisis, we can also expect Beijing to trade less with the bloc. This trend will only get worse. Since 2013, China has been buying less from the EU. Those are the red arrows you see going down on the right. Chinese imports from Germany have fallen especially hard. Beijing can manufacture their own stuff at lower prices. The reverse is happening in Europe. That's the two charts on the left. EU imports from Chinese companies have grown tremendously. German reliance on Chinese imports have grown the most. A lot of these are intermediate goods needed to build German products, so we can expect their import reliance to grow further. Now, Europe has to find a way to bring back affordable energy and they have to do it fast. Unfortunately, with Russian supply cut away, that leaves them with very few alternatives and no affordable hydrogen energy. It's still a hope and a dream. It will forever be just 5 years away. Now, opposition MPs in Germany, they have called for the restarting of nuclear power plants, but nuclear operator E.ON rejected the idea. They say it's not a viable option to restart the decommissioned plants. It would not be economical. Well, maybe it shouldn't have been shut down in the first place. This is not a good outcome for Germany or for Europe. Surveys are forecasting either zero growth or even a recession in 2024 for the Germans. And with Ukraine shutting down the pipeline, a myriad of economic plans have been set ablaze. Now, take Europe's attempt to build EV batteries in a block. It's simply not working out for them. Building homegrown companies has a ton of problems. The majority of EU-led projects, especially those in Germany, have either stalled or have been delayed. There were nearly $50 billion worth of projects announced, but over $30 billion worth faces issues. However, for Asian-led projects, it's the other way around. Only $3 billion have stalled, while 31 billion are still on track, and that's a 90% success rate. Chinese projects are simply winning. They have the technology and the supply chains. The EU doesn't, and now they face an additional energy crisis. So this manufacturing gap which is here is just going to grow further and further into the next few years. And it really calls into question how Brussels is managing the economy. Instead of solving the root cause of the problem, which is energy, they're just blindly forging ahead. Now, partially it's because of pride. If they admit there's a power issue now, then inevitably there'll be links drawn to the Russian energy connection. But how long can you put your head under the sand? Olaf Scholz in Germany made a rather weird statement last week. If we have electric cars in the future, then we must also want a strategic component of the cars to be produced in Europe. But it's going to be very difficult unless production costs come down. Even if you manage to build a battery plant, the output will be so expensive that exporting them out will be impossible. Unfortunately, things are about to get worse here because Russian supply is dropping. The last thing you want to cause is more disruptions. And in a report, Qatar, which is a huge gas supplier to the EU, just gave a fatal warning that the Gulf country will stop EU gas sales if punished under new EU laws. And once again, we are witnessing an own goal by EU policies. It's great to try and save the world, but corporate sustainability when your industries are collapsing, now talk about horrible timing here. According to the law, EU countries can impose fines on companies that fail to meet targets on carbon emissions, human and labor rights, and Qatar isn't very happy about this. If I lose 5% of my generated revenue going into Europe, I will not go to Europe. I'm not bluffing. If the EU imposes fines on Qatar Energy, they simply won't supply the EU. This is the people's money, and nobody would accept losing that kind of money. Qatar Energy can be targeted because they likely earn more than 450 million euros in the EU. So you heard it loud and clear. There's a big systemic issue with Europe that fails to see the bigger picture. Now, I'm not against the environment, I'm not against going green, but there's a time and there's a place for everything. Now, the US can talk about this all day because they have the leverage, but the EU doesn't have the industrial or market leverage today. Trying to impose laws here and there is just going to be very risky indeed. You are playing with fire. And to wean themselves off Russian gas, Europe is highly dependent on LNG from the Middle East. That by itself is already more costly than pipeline gas. In November, the Middle East delivered 1.2 billion cubic meters of LNG to the EU. Compare that to Russia's 1.7 billion and America's 4.6 billion. And if this gets cut off, Europe faces another gas crisis. If they choose to get LNG from Russia, doesn't this cause even more dependency on Putin? Doesn't that just shift even more leverage to Gazprom? This is the dilemma here. Conversely, getting additional LNG from the US is definitely possible. But you're getting cargoes across the Atlantic, which would jack prices up even higher. So Europe is caught between a rock and a hard place. Qatar, they have long-term contracts with Germany, France, and Italy. And these are industrial economies that need affordable energy to stay competitive or at least survive. So if Europe wants cheap energies, they have to relax their rules. Qatar's cost of production can be as low as 30 cents per million BTU. You compare that with up to $5 globally, there can be no comparison here. Now, a big part of this is access to cheap labor, and Qatar isn't going to let this go just for EU legislation. The minister already warned Europe about this in no uncertain terms. There are other analysts out there also concurring with Qatar's price advantage. Shutting supply off will hurt the bloc even further. It will compound the problem. In this report, Qatari LNG production costs range between $2 to $4. The US can hit up to $8 per unit, in Australia up to $10. Trying to get alternatives could jack prices up by 50% or even double it. And who's the big winner from all of this? It will be the United States. Energy companies could get an even bigger windfall from EU demand. And this is the very definition of a captive market. Now, Trump can't wait to sell more gas to the EU. And let's remember this famous speech from von der Leyen. She believes American energy is cheaper. So it won't be a surprise if we see a full transition from Russian LNG to US LNG down the road, especially in 2025.
It's the whole topic of LNG. We still get a lot of LNG via Russia, from Russia. And why not replace it by American LNG, which is cheaper for us and brings down our energy prices, but is something where we can get into a discussion, also what our trade deficit is concerned.
So is this the end of the road for Europe? Well, possibly if they keep scoring more own goals. There's very little reason to manufacture and build stuff in a bloc, especially for foreign companies. But let me know what you think. Can Europe get out of this mess? And will Qatar really cut away exports to the EU? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.